That man, her own brother, stood on a wooden platform in the middle of Red Hollow Market and shouted that she wasn't worth a penny. He didn't say it in the house, not behind closed doors. He said it in front of the whole town, in broad daylight, in the voice of a cattle salesman. Who wants this one to work for? Can't bear children, fat as a pig, but strong as a horse. Clara Whitmore, 28 years old, standing on the rotting wooden platform, heard each word pierce her like a knife. No one stepped out to defend her. No one looked her in the face. Only the wind blowing through the street and the giggling of the men standing by the pub. Then a stranger emerged from the shadows and placed down a silver coin. If it were you, what would you do? Click like and comment the name of the city country you're watching to let me know how far this story has gone. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because the stories that follow are even more shocking than this. The morning it happened, Clara Whitmore woke before the sun. That wasn't unusual. She had been waking before the sun since she was 9 years old, when her mother stopped getting out of bed and someone had to start the fire. Someone had to haul the water. Someone had to make sure her younger brother Harold ate something before school. That someone had always been Clara. By the time she was 12, she had stopped expecting anyone to notice. By the time she was 28, she had stopped expecting much of anything at all. She lay in the narrow cot in the back room of her brother Gerald's house and listened to the sounds of Red Hollow waking up, the clang of the smithy 2 streets over, a dog barking somewhere near the feed store, boots on the boardwalk outside the window. She had been living in that back room for 3 years, ever since their father died and Gerald inherited everything. The house, the land, the money, all of it. And Clara inherited the cot in the expectation that she would be grateful for it. She pulled on her dress in the dark. The fabric strained across her shoulders and hips, and she didn't look at herself in the small mirror nailed to the wall. She had learned not to. Gerald was already awake when she came out. He was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee he had not made himself, and he was looking at her in a way that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. Not the usual way he looked at her, with mild contempt. The way you might look at a piece of furniture you were tired of moving around, but something sharper, calculating. "Sit down," he said. "I need to start breakfast." "Sit down, Clara." She sat. Gerald set his cup on the table and folded his hands the way he did when he was about to explain something he had already decided. He was 41 years old, 5 years older than her, with their father's wide jaw and their mother's small eyes, and none of either parent's better qualities. "I've been thinking," he said, "about arrangements." "What arrangements?" "For you." He said it simply, like it was obvious. "You've been here 3 years. You don't pay rent, you don't contribute money, you cook and clean, which I appreciate, but Mabel can cook and clean." Mabel was Gerald's wife, a thin woman with a tight mouth who had never liked Clara and made no effort to hide it. "The truth is, Clara, you're a burden. I think you know that." Clara kept her face still. She had practice. "I've been talking to some of the men in town," Gerald continued. "There's a need for domestic help out on the ranches. Women who can work, cook, keep house." He paused. "I thought we could make it formal. Put you forward as available." "Put me forward," Claire repeated. "At the market, Saturday." She stared at him. "Gerald, you're talking about selling me like I'm a horse." "I'm talking about finding you a situation." His voice took on the patient, slightly irritated tone of a man who believed he was being very reasonable. "You're not going to find a husband, Clara. We've established that. You can't have children. You're not—" He stopped, glanced at her body, looked away. "It's time to be practical. I'm doing you a favor." She didn't sleep that night. She lay in the dark and tried to find somewhere in her chest where she could put what she was feeling, some room big enough to hold it. There wasn't one. There was only the ceiling above her and the sound of Gerald and Mabel's voices through the wall, low and self-satisfied, and the knowledge that in 3 days she would be stood up in front of people who had known her since childhood and offered to the highest bidder. The practical part of her, the part that had kept the fire going and hauled the water and made sure Harold ate, noted that she had nowhere to go. She had $12.40 in a tin under the cot. She knew no one in any other town. She had no marketable skills beyond cooking and cleaning and mending and all the other invisible work that women did and no one ever counted. She thought about leaving, walking out the door with her $12 and heading west and not stopping. She thought about it for a long time. Then she got up, lit the lamp, and started ironing Gerald's shirts because they needed to be ironed and someone had to do it. Saturday came like a sentence being carried out. Gerald had told her to wear her best dress, which she did, though her best dress was only marginally better than her worst one. Mabel had watched her get ready with a look of thin satisfaction that Clara refused to acknowledge. The walk to the market square felt very long. The September air was cool and sharp, and the sky was the color of old pewter, and Clara walked with her hands at her sides and her chin level and tried not to think about what came next. The market square in Red Hollow was nothing special. A wide dirt expanse between the general store and the saloon, where farmers set out their produce on Saturdays and occasionally townspeople came to buy or trade other things. Horses, equipment, sometimes apparently people. There were already 30 or 40 men and women gathered by the time Gerald stopped her at the edge of a low wooden platform. 3 feet off the ground, rough-cut boards, the kind of thing they used for announcements, and once, Clara remembered, for a traveling preacher who had visited 6 years back and spoken for 2 hours about redemption. She had not thought then that she would one day be standing on it. Gerald put his hand on her arm. Up you go. She looked at the platform. She looked at the crowd. Familiar faces, some of them, people she had cooked for and sewn buttons back onto their coats and helped carry groceries when they were old or sick. Mrs. Hartley from the dry goods store, the Brennan brothers who ran the livery, Frank Dooley, who owned the saloon and had once, years ago, asked her father about courting her before apparently thinking better of it. All of them watching with the blank, mildly curious expression of people who had turned out to see something interesting on a dull Saturday morning. She climbed onto the platform. The wood creaked under her. She was aware of her own size the way she was always aware of it in public, not abstractly, but specifically, as a fact others were noting and assessing. She stood very straight. Gerald stepped up beside her. He had a salesman's voice when he wanted one, a voice that carried without effort, and he used it now. Morning, folks. Most of you know my sister Clara. She's a capable woman, strong as an ox, good cook, can keep a house clean and orderly. She's available for domestic placement. I'm looking for a fair arrangement. Work, room, and board, something reasonable. He paused. She can't have children, as some of you may know, so don't expect that. But for a working ranch that needs help around the house, she'd serve the purpose. She can't have children. He said it like it was part of a livestock description. She cannot produce offspring. The teeth are in good condition. She can carry weight. Clara felt something move through her that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite grief. It was more specific than either of those. It was the particular feeling of having your entire life reduced to its deficiencies in front of an audience and knowing that the audience was nodding along. Someone in the crowd laughed. She didn't see who. $30, said a man in a dirty coat she didn't know. She's worth more than that for the work, Gerald said. Not with that body, she isn't. This from the Brennan brothers' corner. More laughter. Clara fixed her eyes on the far end of the square, on the gap between 2 buildings where the road led out of town, and breathed. She had promised herself on the walk over that she would not cry. She kept the promise. But it cost her something to keep it, something she could feel going, like a stone being pried loose from a wall. She had built that wall a long time ago, and it was solid, and she was not going to let Gerald or the Brennans or whoever the man in the dirty coat was take a piece of it today. $40, said another voice. 45. She was listening to men price her like she was a wagon, and then she heard a voice she didn't recognize. It was quiet, not loud, not carrying, just clear, the way a sound is clear when everything else goes briefly silent. She didn't know why everything went silent. Maybe it was the quality of the voice. Maybe it was the way the man moved through the crowd. Not pushing, not announcing himself, just arriving. The way someone arrives who doesn't feel the need to make an entrance because they've never worried about whether people would pay attention. He was tall. She noticed that first. Not dramatically so, but tall enough that she could see him clearly over the heads of the other men. He wore a rancher's coat, plain and worn at the elbows, and a hat that had seen more weather than it had originally been designed for. His face was in his mid-30s, maybe early 40s. Hard to say because it was a face that had spent a lot of time outdoors and thought a lot of hard thoughts. And both of those things leave marks that make age difficult to read. Dark eyes, dark hair going a little gray at the temples, a jaw that looked like it hadn't smiled in a while. He stopped at the edge of the platform and looked up at her. Not the way the others were looking up, not assessing, not amused, just looking, the way you look at something you're trying to understand. Then he reached into his coat pocket. He held up a single silver coin between two fingers. $1, he said. The crowd went quiet in the particular way that crowds go quiet when something unexpected has happened and they haven't decided yet whether it's funny or insulting. Gerald's face went through several expressions quickly. Now, hold on. $1, the man said again, same volume, no louder. Not because that's what she's worth, because I'm not buying anything. He kept his eyes on Gerald, and I think you know the difference. I don't. You're selling your sister. The man said it plainly. No heat in it, no performance, just the words laid out in the morning air. In a public square, in front of people who know her, I'd like that on record before we continue. Gerald's face went red. Now, you look here. I'm looking, the man said. I see a woman who can work, who isn't going to be bought by the Brennan brothers or whoever that man is in the dirty coat over there. He flicked a glance at the man who'd offered $30. I'm offering her a job, legitimate work, a room, fair wages. He looked up at Clara then, directly, and his voice shifted just slightly. Not softer exactly, but less addressed to the crowd and more addressed to her. If she wants it. The square was very quiet. Clara looked at him. She was trying to figure out what the catch was because there was always a catch. And she was not naive about the fact that strange men who intervened at auction platforms were not necessarily doing so out of pure generosity. She had spent 28 years learning to read what people wanted from her, and she was good at it, and right now she could not read him. What she could read was the rest of the square. She could read Mrs. Hartley's expression of fascinated discomfort. She could read the Brennan brothers' amusement curdling slowly toward offense. She could read Gerald's fury, not at the man, she realized, but at her, because she hadn't looked humiliated enough, because she was still standing straight, because she hadn't given them the satisfaction of seeing her fold. She looked at the man with the coin. What's the work? She said. Something shifted in his face. Not a smile, not quite, but something. Ranch, he said. 8 miles east. I've got 5 kids and a house that's falling apart, and I'm better with cattle than I am with either of those things. He paused. My wife died 14 months ago. The square stayed quiet. Even Gerald didn't say anything. I need someone who can hold a household together, the man said. Cook, keep order, help with the children. It's not easy work. I'll be straight about that. You're looking for a housekeeper, Clara said. I'm looking for someone who's not going to run off after a week, he said. Which, given what I just watched, I have a feeling you're not going to. She turned and looked at Gerald one more time. His face was doing something complicated, anger and embarrassment, and underneath both of those, something that looked almost like relief, as though he had been hoping for exactly this outcome and hadn't wanted to admit it. I'll take the $1, Clara said. She climbed down off the platform. She didn't take Gerald's arm, and she didn't wait for his permission, and she did not look at the crowd. She walked to where the man was standing and stopped in front of him. He held out the coin. She took it. Elias Vance, he said. Clara Whitmore. I know, he said. I've been through Red Hollow before. He said it without elaboration, and she didn't ask for any. I've got a wagon out front of the livery. We can go when you're ready. I need to get my things. I'll wait. She went back to Gerald's house. It took 11 minutes to collect everything she owned. The $12.40 in the tin, 2 dresses, a pair of boots, her mother's sewing kit, a photograph of her parents that she kept in the bottom of a cloth bag where Gerald wouldn't see it and make a comment. She did not say goodbye to Mabel. Mabel was standing in the doorway of the kitchen watching her pack, and Clara looked at her once and looked away. At the door, Gerald caught her arm. Clara. She stopped. He's a hard man, Gerald said. Vance. I know the name. It's not going to be easy out there. She looked at his hand on her arm until he removed it. "It hasn't been easy here," she said. She walked out. The wagon was where Vance said it would be. He was checking the horse's harness when she came up, and he didn't make a fuss about her arrival or ask if she was all right or offer any of the sympathetic commentary she had been bracing herself for. He just looked at the bag she was carrying and said, "That all of it?" "Yes." "All right." He helped her up onto the seat, practical, impersonal, the way you'd help someone up who needed help up, and then climbed up on the other side and got the horse moving. Red Hollow fell away behind them. Clara watched it go without ceremony. She was aware of the coin in her palm, still there because she hadn't found a pocket to put it in yet. She closed her fingers around it. She did not feel rescued. She was clear about that with herself. She felt like a woman who had taken a job under uncertain conditions with a man she didn't know, which was a precarious thing, and she was going to need to figure out, fairly quickly, exactly what kind of precarious thing it was. But she was not on that platform anymore. The road out of town was rutted and the morning was cold, and Elias Vance drove in silence, which was fine by her. She had grown up with people who filled silence with things that made her feel worse, and she had learned to appreciate quiet. After a while, she noticed that he drove with one hand, the reins loose, the other arm resting on his knee. Easy, practiced, the posture of someone who'd made this trip 1,000 times. "How old are the children?" she asked. "Oldest is 16, youngest is 5. He paused. "They're not. They haven't had an easy time, since Martha." He said his wife's name simply, not carefully, the way you say a name when you've had a long time to practice saying it in front of other people. "The oldest, Daniel, he's angry. I'll tell you that straight. He's not going to welcome you." "That's fair," Clara said. "It's not about you." "I know." He glanced at her sidelong. "You seem very calm for a woman who just got offered for sale by her own family." "I am calm," Clara said. "I was angry 3 days ago when I found out. I've had time to get through it." She looked at the road. "What's the youngest's name?" "Lily," he said. She's had a hard time since her mother." He stopped, started again. "She's stopped talking for a while. She talks again now, mostly. But she gets sick easily. Worries me." Clara filed that away. A 5-year-old who had stopped talking. A 16-year-old who was angry. 3 other children somewhere in between, with their own wounds. Living in a ranch house with a father who was better with cattle than he was with either of those things. The wagon rolled east. The sky above them was the same old pewter, but with a seam of pale gold opening along the horizon, and the prairie on either side of the road was brown and dry and going on as far as she could see. Clara Whitmore held the silver coin in her closed hand and thought about what came next, not with dread and not with hope exactly. Hope was a thing she had learned to ration carefully, but with the flat, practical attention she brought to everything that needed to be figured out. A broken household, 5 children, a man she didn't know. Work that wasn't going to be easy. She had done harder things. She would do this one too. The ranch appeared over a low rise an hour later, and when Clara saw it, she understood immediately what Elias Vance meant when he said the house was falling apart. The main house was large, larger than she'd expected, but the porch railing on the left side had collapsed and been propped up with 2 boards that weren't doing the job, and the roof over the kitchen addition showed a dark stain that meant water damage. And the yard in front of the door was not exactly a yard so much as a place where things had been left and not picked up. A broken wagon wheel, a rusted trough, a child's boot, somehow alone, sitting in the dirt like a question nobody had answered. She looked at all of it and said nothing. Elias brought the wagon to a stop and climbed down and came around to her side. When he offered his hand this time, it was more deliberate than it had been at the livery. Considered, like he'd made a decision. She took it and climbed down. The front door of the house opened before either of them reached it, and a boy appeared in the doorway, tall, broad in the shoulders, with his father's dark coloring and a face that was trying very hard to be older than it was. 16 years old. Daniel. He looked at Clara the way she had been looked at all morning, except that where the crowd in Red Hollow had been casually contemptuous, This boy was specifically furious. He looked at her as though her presence here was a personal affront, as though she had done something to him just by arriving. She had seen that look before. She understood it. "Who's this?" he said. Not a question, an accusation. "This is Clara Whitmore," Elias said. "She'll be helping with the house." "We don't need help." "Daniel Duque, we don't." The boy's voice cracked, just slightly, on the second word, and she saw his jaw tighten at the betrayal of it. 16 and trying to be a wall. "We've managed fine." She looked at the yard, the broken railing, the single boot in the dirt. "I can see that," she said. It was the wrong thing to say, or maybe the right thing. She wasn't sure yet. Either way, Daniel's eyes snapped to her face, and for a moment they just looked at each other, and she let him look, and she did not flinch. Then he turned and walked back inside, and the door banged shut behind him. Elias was quiet for a moment. "I told you," he said. "You did," Clara said. She picked up her bag and walked to the front door. She put her hand on the handle and looked back at Elias Vance, who was standing beside the wagon with his hat in his hand and an expression she couldn't read, watching her. She pushed the door open and went inside. The inside of the house hit her in 3 separate ways before she had taken 5 steps through the door. The smell first, not filth exactly, but the accumulated smell of a house where nobody had been on top of things for a long time. Wood smoke and old grease and something sour underneath both of those, and beneath that, even fainter, something that might once have been lavender, the ghost of a woman who had kept things a certain way and whose way had since been abandoned. Then the sight of it. The main room was large, which would have been a point in its favor under different circumstances. A long table with 6 chairs, 2 of them pushed back at angles that suggested they'd been left that way for days. A stone fireplace with ash that needed clearing. Shelves on the far wall with gaps where things had been taken down and not put back. A child's drawing tacked crookedly near the window, the paper curling at the corners. A coat hanging from a nail that was pulling out of the wall, so the coat listed to one side like something tired. And then the children. There were 4 of them in the room when Clara came in. Daniel she had already met. The other 3 were arranged around the space with the slightly guilty look of people who had been arguing just before a door opened and had stopped in a hurry. A girl of about 13 with her father's dark eyes and a braid coming undone. A boy of maybe 10 sitting on the floor against the wall, arms crossed. A smaller girl, perhaps 7, standing near the fireplace, watching Clara with an expression of pure open assessment that had no hostility in it. Just the frank curiosity of a child who hadn't yet learned to hide what she was thinking. Daniel had positioned himself near the far wall. He was not looking at Clara. He was looking at his father, who had come in behind her. "Where's Lily?" Elias asked. "Sleeping," the girl with the braid said. "Still?" "She had a bad night." Elias's face tightened just slightly, the way a face does when it hears something it's heard too many times and still isn't used to. He glanced toward the back of the house, then back at Clara, seeming to remember her. "Ruth," he said to the girl with the braid, "this is Miss Whitmore. She'll be staying on." Ruth looked at Clara with a directness that reminded her oddly of Elias himself. Not warm, not cold, measuring. "Staying on is what?" "Helping with the house," Clara said. "And cooking, I understand, and whatever else needs doing." "Lots of things need doing," the boy on the floor said. He said it without looking up, which made it hard to tell if it was an observation or an accusation. "That's Caleb," Elias said. "He's 10. "I can tell you my own age," Caleb said. "Then do it next time." Caleb said nothing. The smaller girl near the fireplace had not moved or looked away from Clara. Up close she had a round face and a missing front tooth, and her dress was buttoned wrong, 2 buttons off from top to bottom, so the whole thing sat crooked. "I'm May," she said, apparently having decided that no one else was going to handle this part. "I'm 7. Our mother died." "Did Papa tell you?" "He told me," Clara said. "I'm sorry." May seemed to accept this. "Her name was Martha. We're not supposed to be sad about it anymore, but sometimes we still are." "May," Ruth said, with the pained elder sibling tone of someone who has had to manage this before. "That's all right," Claire said. She was looking at May, but she was aware of Daniel in her peripheral vision, the way you're aware of a storm front. He still wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the floor now, jaw set, arms at his sides, doing the hard work of being furious quietly. Being sad doesn't have a schedule, she told May. You can be sad whenever it comes up. May nodded, serious. I know that. I told Caleb that. He doesn't believe me. I believe you, Caleb said from the floor. I just don't want to talk about it all the time. I don't talk about it all the time. You just told a stranger about it 30 seconds after meeting her. Because she should know. Clara set her bag down against the wall and looked at the room again. The light coming through the windows was thin and showed up every surface that needed attention. The table that needed scrubbing, the floor that needed sweeping, the hearth that needed clearing. She had a professional sense of the scope of it, the same way a doctor takes in a patient's condition before deciding where to start. She decided to start with the hearth. Is there firewood? She asked. Stack out back, Elias said. I'll get some. You don't have to do that right now, he said. You just arrived. The fire's going to need rebuilding if we want anything hot by midday, she said. And from the look of this ash, it's been banking low for a couple days. She glanced at him. I'm not the kind of person who sits down and waits to feel settled before I start working. It doesn't happen that way for me. He looked at her for a moment, then stacks out the back door, past the lean-to. She found the wood stack, and it was in better shape than some things on this ranch. Someone had been keeping it stocked, which meant someone had been working, which meant the place hadn't entirely gone to pieces, just most of the way. She carried in 3 loads before anyone offered to help, and when help came, it wasn't from who she expected. Caleb appeared at the back door while she was stacking the 3rd load. He stood watching her with his arms still crossed, the default posture of a 10-year-old who wanted to seem like he hadn't come to help. I can carry more than you, he said. Probably, Clara said. I carry it all the time. Then you know where everything goes. He unfolded his arms, apparently. She didn't see him do it because she wasn't watching him. She'd learned early that children, like skittish horses, cooperated better when you weren't looking directly at them. By the time she turned around, he was already pulling logs off the stack. They carried wood in 2 more trips without talking. Clara started relaying the hearth. Caleb watched her for a minute. You're doing it wrong, he said. Show me, she said. This surprised him. She could tell because he went still, like he'd been ready for her to argue and didn't know what to do when she didn't. Then he crouched down beside her and rearranged the bottom layer the way he'd apparently been taught. Mama showed me, he said. He said it matter-of-factly, the way children say things they've made themselves say out loud enough times that they've taken the edge off. She knew what she was doing, Clara said, looking at his arrangement. That's better than what I had. He shrugged one shoulder. She lit the fire the way he'd laid it. Lunch was a problem. The kitchen had the bones of a functioning space. A good stove, solid shelves, an adequate supply of dried goods, and preserved things in the cellar. But it had the disorganized look of a kitchen run by people who were doing their best and not quite getting there. Things were in the wrong places. The flour bin was nearly empty, and the salt pork had been left out longer than it should have been. There were dishes in the dry sink that someone had started washing and then stopped partway through. Clara found enough to make a reasonable soup, dried beans that had been pre-soaked, some root vegetables going soft but still serviceable, the salt pork in careful portions. She got it going and then worked on the kitchen while it cooked, not reorganizing everything at once. That would have felt too much like a takeover, too much like she was erasing what had been there before, but straightening and locating things, building a map in her head. Ruth came in while she was working. The girl sat down at the kitchen table and watched Clara with an expression that was trying to be neutral and not entirely succeeding. You know how to cook? Ruth asked. Yes. Mama had a system in here for where things went. I won't move anything until I know what the system was, Clara said. Can you tell me? Ruth blinked. She had clearly not been expecting that either. Dried goods on the left shelf, preserves on the right, pans hung in order of size. Makes sense, Clara said. She went about restoring things to those positions. Your mother thought about efficiency. This is a good layout. Ruth was quiet for a moment. You don't have to be nice about her. Clara glanced at her. I'm not being nice. I mean it. People are usually nice about her because they feel bad for us. I've known too many kitchens that didn't make sense, Clara said. This one does. That's not about feeling bad for anyone. She stirred the soup. How old are you? 13. Then you've been running this kitchen since you were 12. Ruth didn't answer. That was an answer. You've done well, Clara said. The stores are in reasonable shape. The stove's been maintained. Someone's been cooking. I have, Ruth said, and there was a complex thing in her voice, pride and exhaustion and resentment all tangled up together. Papa tried for a while. He's better now, but he's busy with the cattle and the other things, and Daniel thinks he should be doing all of it, so they fight about it. What does Daniel think should happen? Clara asked carefully. Daniel thinks we don't need anyone. Ruth's voice went flat on this, the flatness of someone who has argued about this until they have no more words for it. He thinks we're doing fine. What do you think? The girl looked at her hands on the table. I think I'm tired, she said, and she said it so simply and so plainly that Clara had to look away for a moment, out the window above the sink, at the gray sky and the flat brown prairie beyond the fence. You're 13, Clara said. You shouldn't be the one who's tired. Ruth said nothing, but she stayed at the table. She didn't leave. Lunch happened the way first meals in uncertain situations always happen, with the children arranged around the table according to invisible territorial rules that Clara was not yet fluent in, with silences that were doing more work than the conversation, with the awareness of absence in the chair that no one sat in. There were 6 chairs and 5 children and 1 adult and 1 chair that nobody used. Clara noted it and said nothing. She sat at the end farthest from it. Elias came in from outside, smelling of horses and cold air, and sat down at the head with the particular kind of tired that comes from physical work and not enough sleep, and looked at the soup with an expression Clara couldn't entirely read. You found enough to work with, he said. Almost. You'll need flour by end of week, and the salt pork situation needs attention. I'll go into town Saturday. Caleb ate with focus and intent, which was good. May ate with enthusiasm, commenting periodically on the flavor in a way that seemed designed to be helpful, and landed somewhere between charming and anxious. Ruth ate steadily and said little. The boy Clara hadn't properly spoken to yet, Thomas, she'd gathered, 11 years old and positioned between Caleb and May, ate without looking up, which could have meant shy or could have meant something else. And Daniel did not come to the table. Elias noticed. Clara saw him notice. A tightening around the eyes, a set of the jaw, a decision being made not to address it in front of everyone. She understood that decision. She made no comment. After the meal, while Clara was washing the dishes, she heard voices from somewhere toward the back of the house, not arguing exactly, something below arguing, an exchange with all the heat of a fight and none of the volume, which usually meant it was about something real. She washed the dishes. She didn't go to listen. That wasn't her place, not yet, maybe not ever. When Elias came back through the kitchen, his face was arranged carefully, the way you arrange a face when you don't want to explain what just happened. He'll come around, he said. He doesn't have to, Claire said. He's not. I don't want you to think he's a bad kid. I don't think that. She dried her hands on the cloth by the sink. He lost his mother. He's 16. He's trying to hold something together that keeps slipping. She set the cloth down. That's not bad. That's just hard. Elias looked at her for a moment. You have a lot of experience with difficult situations. I have a lot of experience, she said simply. Difficult situations were usually what was available. The afternoon she spent on the house, which was a project of significant scope and not something she was going to get through in a day or a week or possibly a month. She was realistic about this. She moved through the rooms, making assessments without touching things that didn't need touching yet. The children's rooms were theirs, and she stepped in only far enough to confirm that they were livable, which they were, barely. Ruth's room showed signs of someone trying hard. Caleb and Thomas shared a room that showed signs of no one trying at all, in the charming way that boys' rooms often don't. May's room was next to a smaller room that Clara understood, from the way the door was kept open and the small bed was neatly made in a way that nothing else in the house was neatly made, to have been a project of love, Martha's child, the youngest, Lily. She didn't go into Lily's room. She found Lily at the end of the afternoon, and not where she expected. She was in the barn. Clara had gone out to find a mop and found instead, in the back stall, a small figure sitting in the hay beside one of the horses, a bay mare with a patient temperament who stood completely still while the child leaned against her flank. Lily was 5 years old and small for it, with her mother's features, according to Ruth, pale and delicate with dark circles under her eyes that said she hadn't been sleeping well. She looked at Clara without fear. That was the first thing. Some children went watchful and distant around strangers, and some went wary, and some cried. Lily just looked at her with a pair of gray eyes that were too old for her face. "Hello," Clara said. Lily said nothing, but she didn't move. Clara didn't make a production of the moment. She found what she'd come for, a mop handle propped against the wall nearby, and reached for it without rushing, without looming. "That's a good horse," she said. Lily looked at the mare, seemed to consider this, nodded once. "She let you sit with her?" Another nod. "Horses are good for that," Clara said. "Sitting next to something big and calm helps when things feel bad." She straightened with the mop. "I'll let you two be." She was halfway to the barn door when she heard it, small, careful, like a word that had been considered from all angles before being released. "Her name's Sunday." Clara stopped, turned around. Lily was still leaning against the mare, looking at Clara with those two old eyes. "Sunday," Clara repeated. "That's a good name for a horse." "Mama named her," Lily said. "Your mama had good taste," Clara said. Lily considered that for a long moment. Then she turned back to the horse, resting her cheek against the warm flank. The conversation was over. Clara went back to the house. That night was the real test of the situation, and Clara knew it before it started. Dinner she managed from more of the stores, supplemented by some dried apples she'd found at the back of the cellar that were still good. She cooked enough and made it decent. Not fancy, not impressive, just solid and warm and enough. And when the family sat down, Daniel was at the table this time. He'd come in from whatever he'd been doing outside, face closed, eyes down, and taken his place without explanation or acknowledgement. She served without comment. He ate without comment. It was not warm, but it was progress of a kind. The trouble came after. She was in the kitchen when she heard the crash. Not a small crash, a significant one from the direction of the main room, followed by Caleb's voice at high volume, and Thomas saying something underneath it, and then, clearly, Daniel, "Shut up, both of you, shut up." She came to the kitchen doorway. Caleb was on his feet with his chair knocked over behind him, and a red mark on his forearm that was going to be a bruise. Daniel was standing at the other end of the table with his hands flat on the surface, leaning forward, and his face was doing the thing that faces do when they're trying to contain something that doesn't fit inside a face. Elias was not in the room. He'd gone to check on something outside. "What happened?" Clara said. "Nothing," Daniel said immediately. "Caleb's arm." "He fell." "I didn't fall," Caleb said. He was 10 and furious and trying not to cry, which was a complicated combination. He shoved the table and it caught my arm. "I told you to move," Daniel said, with the specific logic of someone who knows they're wrong and is committed anyway. "I told you twice. I was sitting there first. I needed room." "You always need room, and the rest of us are supposed to move." "Caleb," Clara said. He stopped, looked at her. "Let me see your arm." He came over with the reluctance of a boy who didn't want to need help but wanted his arm acknowledged. She looked at it. A good bruise forming, nothing broken, he'd be sore but fine. She didn't say anything to Daniel yet. She got the cloth from the kitchen and wrapped Caleb's arm and told him to sit back down, and he did. Thomas had not moved or spoken through any of this. May had retreated to the fireplace. Ruth was in the doorway to the hallway. When that was settled, Clara turned to Daniel. He was still standing, still leaning on the table, except now the posture was less aggression and more like he was holding himself up with it. "You could apologize," she said. She said it simply. Not an accusation. A statement of available options. His jaw tightened. "I don't take instruction from you." "You don't have to," she said. "I'm not your mother. I'm not trying to be. But your brother's arm is going to hurt tomorrow, and it didn't need to." Something moved across his face. It was fast, and he covered it fast. "You don't know anything about this family." I know what I've seen today, she said. I know you've been carrying things you're too young to carry. I know that makes a person angry. She kept her voice level. Not gentle exactly. Gentle would have been wrong, would have been condescending, direct. Being angry isn't the problem. Your brother's arm is. The silence lasted long enough that she could hear the fire and the wind outside the window. Then Daniel straightened up and turned and walked out the back door. It didn't slam. That was something. Caleb was watching her. He does that, he said. He leaves when he doesn't want to do something. I know, Clara said. He's not always like this, Ruth said from the doorway. She said it like she needed to, like it was important. Before Mama, he was different. I believe you, Clara said. She cleared the dinner things. She put the kitchen to rights. Outside, eventually, she heard the back door again, and footsteps through the main room and the sound of Daniel going up the stairs. Not coming to apologize. Not coming to talk. Just coming back inside. She lay in the small room off the kitchen, a housekeeper's room, barely big enough for the narrow bed and the single hook on the wall, and held the silver coin in the dark. $1. Not buying anything. The mattress was thin and the room was cold, and somewhere above her she could hear the house settling, the particular sounds of an old structure moving through the night, and underneath that the small sounds of children in various states of sleeplessness. A cough from one direction. Footsteps, light and careful, probably May. The low murmur of what might have been Thomas talking in his sleep. She thought about the 5 of them, the specific, individual weight of each of them, which she had spent the day absorbing. Ruth, who was tired at 13 and trying not to let it show. Caleb, who had shown her how to build a fire and was still making up his mind about her. Thomas, who had still said almost nothing and whom she hadn't figured out yet. May with the misaligned buttons and the too frank assessment. Lily in the barn with her 2 old eyes and 1 quiet word given like a gift. And Daniel. Daniel, who was angry for good reasons and couldn't find anywhere to put the anger that didn't cost someone else something. She thought about what Ruth had said. He was different before. She thought about what it did to a 16-year-old boy to lose a parent and then feel the remaining parent retreating, not from neglect but from grief, which is its own kind of distance. She thought about what it did to the oldest child to become, overnight, the one who was supposed to hold everything. She had been that person. In a different house, a different way. She knew what the inside of it felt like. She didn't sleep well. The room was unfamiliar and the mattress was hard, and her mind wouldn't stop its cataloging. The things that needed doing, the things she'd noted, the particular way the kitchen shelves were organized, and the water barrel was getting low, and the mop head was worn through and needed replacing. At some point in the deep middle of the night, she heard something that made her go still. A sound from the main room, soft, irregular. Not footsteps. She sat up, listened. It came again, small. Trying to be quiet. She got up and went to the door and opened it without hurrying, and in the main room, in the chair closest to the fireplace where the banked coals still gave off some warmth, sat Lily. The child was in her nightdress, and her feet were bare, and she was not crying exactly, but she had the face of someone who had been crying recently and had run out of energy for it. She looked up when Clara came in. Clara did not say anything. She went to the woodpile and put 2 pieces on the fire and got it going again, and then she got the blanket from the back of the nearest chair and brought it to Lily and laid it over her. She didn't ask what was wrong. She didn't say anything. She pulled the other chair around and sat down beside her. Lily looked at the fire for a long while. I had a dream, she said finally, in that small, careful voice. About your mama? A pause. Then, she was in the kitchen, and then she wasn't. Clara didn't fill the silence. She let it sit. Does it go away? Lily asked. She said it the way someone asks a question they know might not have a good answer. 5 years old and already braced for complicated truths. Clara looked at the fire. It changes, she said. It doesn't go away, but it changes. It gets quieter. When? Different for different people. Lily considered this. Caleb says it's been long enough. Caleb's 10, Claire said. He doesn't get to decide how long is long enough. The ghost of something moved across Lily's face. It might have been the beginning of something that would eventually be a smile. They sat by the fire for a while longer. Eventually, Lily's eyes started to close, head drooping toward her own shoulder, and Clara picked her up. She weighed almost nothing, burning slightly warm the way children do when they're overtired, and carried her back to her room and settled her into the neatly made bed. She was halfway back to her own room when she became aware that someone was watching her from the top of the stairs. She looked up. Daniel stood on the landing, barely visible in the dark. He would have heard her with Lily. He would have heard what she said. He didn't say anything. She didn't either. He went back to his room. She went back to hers. She lay in the dark and stared at the ceiling and thought that this was going to be a long process. Not a quick thing. Not a situation that would resolve in a week or a month because someone was patient and kind. These children had wounds that had been accumulating for 14 months, on top of wounds they'd probably had before that. And she was a stranger who had been here 12 hours. And the most she could do for now was be consistent. Show up. Do the work. Not run. She was good at not running. That at least she knew. The coin was on the windowsill. In the dark, she couldn't see it, but she knew it was there. Small and silver and worth exactly $1, and meaning something else entirely to her now than it had when Elias Vance held it up in Red Hollow's market square that morning. She closed her eyes. Outside, the prairie wind pressed against the house, and the house held. 3 weeks in, Clara had established a fragile kind of order. The sort that holds together not because anything has been resolved, but because everyone has agreed without saying so to behave as though it has. The kitchen ran on Martha's system now, fully restored, and meals happened at regular times, which mattered more than anyone acknowledged. Regular meals meant regular gathering, and regular gathering meant the family sat in the same room at the same time every day, which was not nothing. It was, in fact, the scaffolding on which everything else was slowly being built. Caleb had started talking to her with something approaching comfort, though he was careful not to make it obvious. Thomas had spoken to her 3 times at length, once about a horse with a bad shoe, once about a school lesson he didn't understand, once, unexpectedly, about his mother's habit of humming while she cooked, and whether that was a thing all mothers did or just theirs. May had appointed herself Clara's shadow for approximately 4 hours of every day, and had to be gently redirected when she followed her into the barn. Ruth remained watchful. She was doing less now. Less cooking, less managing, less running of the household. And this should have been a relief, but Clara suspected it wasn't entirely, because Ruth had built her identity around being the one who kept things going, and Clara's arrival had quietly dismantled the job. She tried to give the girl other things. She asked her opinion on meals and listened to it. She taught her 2 things she didn't know: how to properly set a bone broth to clear, and how to repair a seam so it didn't show. Ruth received these lessons with the careful pride of someone who wasn't sure whether being taught was an insult or a gift. Lily came to the fireside less often now at night, but she still did sometimes, and on those nights Clara sat with her without making it a thing, just 2 people by the fire, until the child's eyes went heavy. And Daniel. Daniel was the remaining problem, the one that hadn't shifted. And Clara was watching it carefully because she had seen enough of the boy by now to understand that his anger was not going to come undone through patience alone. Patience was necessary, but not sufficient. He needed something to happen. She didn't know yet what that something was. She was thinking about this on a Wednesday morning in the 4th week when Elias came in from outside with his coat still on and his face doing the careful arrangement thing. "Lily's worse," he said. Clara had heard Lily coughing in the night. She had noted it with the part of her mind that was always half listening, the same part that had kept the fire going and made sure her brother ate. "How much worse?" "Won't get up. Fever." She dried her hands and went. Lily was in her bed with the quilt pulled up and her face the color of old candle wax. The dark circles under her eyes were darker. Her breathing had a quality to it. Not labored, not yet, but effortful. Each inhale with a slight catch at the end that shouldn't have been there. Clara put her hand on the child's forehead. Hot. Not the worst kind of fever she'd ever felt, but not mild either. "How long?" she asked Elias, who was standing in the doorway. "Ruth said she was off yesterday. I thought she was tired." "Has she eaten?" "Some broth last night. Not much." Lily's eyes were open and watching Clara with the same too-old look she always had. but turned inward now, focused somewhere else. "My chest hurts," she said. "I know," Clara said. "I'm going to help with that." She went to the kitchen and got to work. She knew what she had and what she needed. The stores were reasonable now. She'd seen to that. And she had a careful knowledge of what could be done with ginger and dried thyme and a mustard poultice, which she had learned from a woman in Red Hollow who had been a healer of the unofficial kind, the kind that small towns produce when there's no doctor within reasonable distance. Red Hollow's doctor was 20 miles from here. The nearest town to the ranch was Declan's Crossing, 11 miles west, and its doctor, a man named Phelan, was present on Tuesdays and Fridays only, and today was Wednesday. She made the broth first, proper broth with everything she could put in it, and she made the poultice while it cooked, and she went back to Lily with both. Ruth appeared in the hallway outside Lily's room while Clara was applying the poultice. "Is she going to be all right?" Ruth asked. She was asking it with the particular controlled expression of a 13-year-old who had learned to keep fear quiet. "I'm working on it," Clara said. This was the most honest answer. She was not going to tell Ruth that everything was fine when she didn't know that yet. Ruth stayed in the doorway. She got sick in February, too, after Mama died. Papa didn't know what to do, and she got through it on her own. "What did you do for her then?" "Kept her warm, gave her water. Caleb sat with her." Ruth's voice was flat and practical, the way a voice gets when it's describing something it had to get through. "I was scared the whole time." "You did what you could," Clara said. "It wasn't enough." "She's here," Clara said. She didn't say it as comfort. She said it as fact. Ruth seemed to hear the difference. The day went hard. Lily's fever climbed through the morning, not dramatically, not the kind of spike that meant something had gone badly wrong all at once, but steadily. The slow climb that was in some ways more worrying because it didn't announce itself as a crisis and therefore could be mistaken for something manageable until it suddenly wasn't. Elias came and went from the doorway all morning. He was not a man who could sit still in an emergency. He needed to do something with his hands, and since the thing happening was not the kind that could be fixed with hands, he found work near the house and stayed within earshot. Clara heard him splitting wood past the point where wood needed splitting. She understood. By noon, the fever had reached the point where Lily stopped making sense when she talked. She said things that weren't addressed to anyone present. Fragments, a word or two, a name that Clara didn't recognize. At one point she said "Mama," very clearly, and then was quiet for a long time. The children knew. Word had passed through the house the way it always passes in small spaces. Without announcement, through some osmosis of shared attention, everyone becoming aware simultaneously that something serious was happening. May had not followed Clara into the barn or anywhere else since morning. She was sitting at the kitchen table drawing something with a stub of pencil, very quietly. Thomas was outside with Elias. Ruth was alternating between the kitchen and the hallway outside Lily's room. Daniel was nowhere visible. Clara worked through the afternoon with the focused practicality of someone who has nothing left to do but the next right thing. She refreshed the poultice at intervals and changed the wet cloths on Lily's forehead and kept the fire in the room exactly right, warm enough but not close, and got small amounts of liquid into the child when she could, a spoonful at a time, which Lily sometimes accepted and sometimes turned her face from. The fever peaked mid-afternoon. Clara knew it was the peak because Lily went very still and very quiet, and the heat coming off her was like holding your hand near a stove. She sent Ruth to get Elias. He came in and stood at the foot of the bed and looked at his youngest child with a face that had gone somewhere past the careful arrangement and was just raw underneath. He had a big man's particular helplessness in this moment, the helplessness of someone whose physical capability, which had always been adequate for the problems life presented, was simply not applicable here. "Tell me what to do," he said. "Sit with her," Clara said. "Hold her hand if she'll let you. Talk to her. She can hear you even when she doesn't respond." "What are you going to do?" "Keep working." He sat down on the edge of the bed and took Lily's small hand in both of his. Clara noticed the size of the contrast. His hands enormous and rough, hers barely visible between them. She went back to the kitchen for more hot water. She was at the stove when she heard someone come into the kitchen behind her, and she turned around expecting Ruth, and it was Daniel. He looked like he'd been outside, His coat was on, his face wind-chapped. He stood just inside the door and looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Something had gone out of it. The wall was still there, but it had shifted, loosened, the way a wall does when the ground underneath it moves. "How bad is it?" he said. "The fever's at its height," Clara said. She kept her voice even. "She needs to get through this part." "What happens if she doesn't?" She looked at him. He was asking because he needed to know, not because he was asking her to confirm his worst fear. This was a boy who had learned that it was better to know than not to know, which was a thing you learned by having the worst happen once already. "I'm not going to let that happen if I can stop it," Clara said. "But you can't promise." "No," she said. "I can't." He stood there. She turned back to the stove. "What can I do?" he said. She stopped. He said it again, flatter, like he was angry at himself for having to say it. "What can I do? I need something to do." She thought for one moment. "There's a plant," she said. "Grows near the creek bed east of the property. Low gray-green leaves, smells like camphor if you crush them. Your mother might have known it. It's used for chest congestion." His eyes changed. "She grew some. In the kitchen garden. There might still be some there." "Show me where." They went together, the two of them out the back door and across the yard to the small fenced kitchen garden that had gone largely untended since Martha died. It had not been entirely abandoned. Someone had kept the gate latched and the worst of the weeds out, and Clara suspected that someone was Ruth without the recognition she deserved for it. Daniel crouched at the far corner of the garden and pushed aside some dead growth, and underneath it, protected by the taller brown stalks, were 4 or 5 low plants still holding on, their gray-green color muted by the cold but present. "That them?" Clara asked. He crushed a leaf between his fingers and held it up. The smell was immediate, sharp, medicinal, unmistakable. "Yes," she said. He harvested them carefully, more carefully than she would have expected from a 16-year-old boy in a hurry. When she looked at his face, she saw why. He was doing it the way someone showed him to do it, and the someone who showed him was present in the doing. They went back inside. She showed him how to prepare it, how to steep the leaves in the hot water, how to make a steam preparation that Lily could breathe. He worked beside her at the stove without speaking. His hands were steady. She noted that. "Your mother taught you the garden," Clara said. It wasn't a question. "She taught me a lot of things," he said. She nodded and let that be. The steam preparation went to Lily's room. Elias was still there, still holding the child's hand, and Lily was still in the high flat part of the fever. Clara set up the steam and positioned it carefully, and Elias watched her with his whole careful attention. "Where did you learn this?" he said. "Woman named Dot McCready, Red Hollow. She was the closest thing that town had to a doctor for 30 years. Clara adjusted the bowl. "She didn't like me much, but she taught anyone who wanted to know." "Why didn't she like you?" Clara almost smiled. "She said I was the kind of stubborn that was either going to save lives or ruin them, and she hadn't decided which." Elias looked at her for a moment. "Which was it?" "Ask me at the end of tonight," she said. The hours after that were the long kind. The hours that move differently than regular hours, slower in some ways and faster in others, where time becomes less about the clock and more about the small changes in front of you that you're watching for. A shift in breathing, a change in color, a temperature moving in one direction or the other. Clara did not leave the room. She was aware that she had been awake since before dawn and that her back ached from the narrow bed and the day's work. She was aware of being hungry, which she addressed once by eating something she brought back from the kitchen and didn't really taste. She was aware that outside the window, the sky had gone dark and that the house had gone quiet with the particular quiet of sleeping children. She sat beside Lily's bed and did the work. Refreshed the cloths, managed the steam, kept the fire right, talked occasionally to the child even when the child wasn't responsive in any visible way. She told Lily about the kitchen garden. She told her about the plant and how her mother had grown it there on purpose, which meant her mother had known about it, which meant her mother had prepared for things like this, which meant she had been exactly the kind of woman who thought ahead and took care. She didn't know if Lily could hear her. She said it anyway. At some point past midnight, Elias fell asleep in the chair at the foot of the bed. She let him. He needed it, and she didn't, or at least the need wasn't going to win tonight. She was alone with Lily and the fire and the sound of the house when she felt it change, It was subtle. The small body in the bed seemed to exhale something that it had been holding. The shallow, effortful breathing evened out, incrementally, not dramatically. Not the sudden easing that happens in stories, but the small, quiet shift of a fever beginning, very slowly, to release its grip. Clara put her hand on Lily's forehead, still warm, but less. She sat back. She had not let herself feel the fear while it was happening. That was not how she functioned. The fear was there, but she had put it somewhere useful, turned it into attention and action. Now, in the quiet, it came back to her in the form of exhaustion so complete that she had to close her eyes for a moment and just breathe. The fire crackled. Outside, wind moved through the dark. Lily's chest rose and fell with less effort than it had in 12 hours. "There you go," Clara said softly. "There you go." She didn't sleep. Not all the way. She drifted in and out of something adjacent to sleep, upright in the chair, coming alert at every small sound until the sounds resolved into normal sounds. The house, the fire, the breathing of a sick child moving toward recovery. When Elias woke at some point before dawn, he looked at Clara first, before he looked at Lily, which told her something about the night from his perspective. She said, "Temperature's coming down." He looked at Lily. He put his hand on her forehead the way Clara had. His face did something that Clara looked away from because it was private. "She's cooler," he said. "Yes." He sat with it for a moment. "You've been here all night." "Yes." "Clara, I wasn't going to leave her," she said simply. There was nothing complicated about it in her mind. You didn't leave a sick child alone through a bad night. That was not a thing she was capable of. He didn't say anything else. She understood that there wasn't anything to say. Dawn came gray and cold, the way October dawns come on the prairie, and with it the sounds of the house stirring. Ruth first. She always woke early, another thing she'd taken from her mother's habits. Then Caleb and Thomas. Voices from upstairs, the thump of boots. Then May, appearing in the doorway of Lily's room, with her hair loose and her eyes wide. "Is she better?" May said. No preamble. Straight to the point, which was May's particular quality. "Getting there," Clara said. May came into the room and stood beside the bed and looked at her little sister with an expression that was trying to be normal and wasn't. Then she reached out and took Lily's hand, the one that wasn't being held by Elias, and held it. Lily opened her eyes. They were clearer than they'd been in 18 hours. "You're here," Lily said to May. Her voice was rough and thin. "I've been here the whole time," May said. "I was right outside." "I know," Lily said. "I could hear you drawing." May blinked. "I was in the kitchen." "I could still hear you." Lily looked at the ceiling, then at Clara. "My chest doesn't hurt as much." "Good," Clara said. "You're going to be sore for a few days, but the bad part's over." Lily looked at her with those gray eyes, tired and clear. "You stayed all night." "Yes." "Papa too?" "Yes." Lily seemed to process this. Then she looked at the ceiling again. "Will you make the soup from yesterday, the one with the apples?" "If you can keep broth down first," Clara said. "I can." "Then yes." The morning moved differently than the day before. The relief in the house was a physical thing, present in the way people moved through rooms, the slightly expanded quality of the air. Ruth made biscuits without being asked, which she sometimes did when she was feeling something she didn't want to say out loud. Caleb went to check on the chickens with unusual thoroughness. Thomas set the table without being asked, which had not happened even once in the 4 weeks Clara had been there. She was at the stove when Daniel came downstairs. He looked at her, and she looked at him. He had the evidence of a poor night's sleep on his face, which meant he'd been awake with the rest of them in his own way. He didn't say anything for a long moment. Then, "Is she awake?" "Yes, asking for soup." He exhaled. It was not a large exhale, but it carried a lot of weight. He stood in the kitchen with his hands in his pockets and his jaw working on something. "I was in the barn last night," he said. "Most of it. I couldn't be in the house." "I know," Clara said. She did know. She'd seen the lamp through the barn window around 2 in the morning. "I should have been—" He stopped, started again. "I'm the oldest. I should have been helping." "You were the one who found the plants," she said. He looked at her. "That's not the same as—" You found the plants your mother grew, you knew them on sight. You harvested them the way she showed you. She kept her voice even. That's not nothing, Daniel. That's what we needed. His face worked on itself. I'm not saying sorry to you. I'm not asking you to. I'm saying... He stopped, shook his head. I don't know what I'm saying. You stayed, Clara said, in the barn, on the property. You got up and came to the kitchen and you asked what you could do. She turned back to the stove. That's enough. That's where you start. He stood there for another moment. Then he went down the hall to Lily's room, and she heard his voice, low and uncertain and young, more young than he usually let himself sound, saying something she couldn't make out. She didn't try to make it out. She kept cooking. Elias came into the kitchen while she was managing the broth and stood with his coffee and said nothing for a while. This had become a thing between them. The morning standing together in the kitchen, him with coffee, her with whatever work was at hand, a shared quiet that was companionable without being anything more. She had come to rely on it more than she expected to. Phelan comes tomorrow, he said. Phelan was the doctor. I'll have him look at her. Good. He'll tell me exactly what you did and that it was right, he said. There was something in his voice that was almost wry. He might tell you something different was needed, she said honestly. He won't. He drank his coffee. She's breathing because of you. Clara didn't answer. She had a particular relationship with compliments. She didn't dismiss them the way some people did, falsely modest, but she also wasn't comfortable sitting in them. She absorbed them practically, noted them, moved on. How long ago did your wife die? She asked. She had not asked him directly before. She'd gotten the information in pieces, from the children, from context. 14 months, he said. Same way he'd said it the first day. Fever, in the end. Same kind of thing. The kitchen was quiet. Lily was 4, he continued. She didn't really understand. She asked for her mother for 2 weeks, and then she stopped asking and started going quiet, and the quiet was harder to watch. You watched her come back, Claire said. She's talking. She's asking for soup. Because of you, he said again. Because she's stronger than she looks, Claire said. I just kept the fire right. He set down his cup and looked at her in the way that was different from the way he usually looked at her, not the considering look he used when he was working something out, and not the practical rancher's look he used when they were discussing the household. Something else. Something that she noticed and then deliberately didn't pursue, because there was too much still to be figured out between all of them, and she had learned to be careful with things that were fragile. I didn't know what I was getting, he said. When I put that coin down, I told myself it was practical. The ranch needed someone who could work. The children needed someone. I didn't let myself think past that. She waited. I got more than I planned for, he said. She picked up the spoon and stirred the broth. Don't make it sentimental, she said. The work's not done. I'm not being sentimental. You're getting close. He picked up his cup. The corner of his mouth moved just slightly in a way she'd come to recognize as the closest he usually got to a smile. Yes, ma'am, he said, with a gravity that was not entirely serious, and went outside. She stayed at the stove. The broth simmered. Through the window she could see the gray sky lightening at the edges, the morning coming on slow. 4 weeks ago she had stood on a wooden platform in the middle of Red Hollow, while her brother described her deficiencies to an audience. She had held her chin level and looked at the far end of the square and counted the things she knew how to do, which had felt at the time like an act of will so small it was almost private. She had kept a child alive through the night with camphor leaves and a knowledge of fevers and the simple refusal to sit down and wait for someone else to handle it. The coin was still on the windowsill of her room. She thought about it sometimes with a feeling she didn't have an exact word for. Not vindication, which was too loud, and not satisfaction exactly, which was too smooth. Something more like the feeling of standing in a particular place and knowing you had earned the right to stand there. She ladled the broth into a small bowl and set it on a tray and carried it to Lily's room, and Lily was awake and waiting for her with the tired clarity of a child on the other side of something bad. And Clara sat on the edge of the bed and helped her drink it, spoonful by spoonful, until the bowl was half gone and the child's eyes were drifting closed again. "More later," Clara said. "With the apples," Lily said, eyes already shut. "With the apples," Clara said. She sat there another minute, just listening to the child breathe. In and out, easy, no catch at the end of it. It was going to be a cold winter. She could feel it in the way the mornings came, the way the light had started slanting different over the past 2 weeks, the way the horses pressed close to the barn wall when the wind picked up. There was a lot of work ahead: firewood, stores, the roof over the kitchen extension that still needed proper repair, the children who were still in various stages of the kind of healing that didn't show on the outside. Daniel was in Lily's room when she left. He'd pulled the chair to the bedside and was sitting in it with his elbows on his knees, watching his sister sleep, and he looked in that moment not like the wall he'd been working to become, but like what he actually was: a 16-year-old boy who had almost lost the last piece of something he couldn't afford to lose. He didn't look up when Clara left. She went back to the kitchen and started the day. Lily recovered slowly, the way children recover from things that have genuinely frightened them. Not all at once, not in a straight line, but in increments, with setbacks that weren't setbacks so much as the body insisting on its own pace. By the end of the first week, she was sitting up. By the end of the second, she was back in the barn with Sunday, leaning against the mare's flank with the blanket Clara had started sending with her because the barn was cold, and Lily ran thin. Dr. Phelan had come on the Friday after the fever broke, examined Lily with the unhurried competence of a man who had been practicing medicine in frontier conditions for 20 years, and told Elias that whoever had managed the fever had known what they were doing. He said it while looking at Clara with the particular expression of a man who had expected to be called in to manage a tragedy and was somewhat inconvenienced by the absence of one. She had not pointed this out. She had simply shown him what she'd used, and he had nodded and said she'd done well and left. November arrived, and the cold with it, the real cold, the kind that came off the mountains to the north and meant business. Clara had been preparing for it since the first week of October. The firewood, the stores, the kitchen garden put to bed properly this time. The gaps in the main house's insulation identified and addressed one by one with the materials available, which were not always the right materials but were what there was. The roof over the kitchen extension had been a more serious problem. She had raised it with Elias, and he had looked at it and agreed, and then spent 3 days with Daniel on the repair, the two of them working in a silence that was not quite comfortable but was functional, which was its own kind of progress. She had noticed things between Elias and Daniel shifting in the weeks since Lily's fever. Not dramatically. There was no scene, no reconciliation that could be pointed to as the moment. But the quality of their silences had changed. Daniel had started appearing for things without being asked. He fixed the porch railing that had been held up by 2 insufficient boards since before Clara arrived. He brought in firewood without being told. He worked beside his father on the roof without the audible resentment that had characterized their earlier proximity. He still did not warm to Clara in any explicit way. But the active resistance had gone out of him. She would catch him sometimes watching her from across a room with an expression she couldn't fully read, not hostility, but something unresolved, like a question he hadn't yet decided to ask. She let him take his time. She was not in a hurry. What she was not prepared for was Gerald. Her brother arrived on a Tuesday morning in the second week of November, without notice, in a wagon that had seen better decades. Clara was in the kitchen when she heard the wheels in the yard, and she looked out the window and felt her stomach drop in a specific way that she recognized as the particular physical response her body had developed to her brother's presence. Not fear, exactly, more like the bracing that happens before something unpleasant, but survivable. She wiped her hands and went to the door. Gerald climbed down from the wagon with the careful deliberateness of a man who had been rehearsing his manner during an 11-mile drive. He was wearing his good coat, which meant this was a performance of some kind. Behind him, Mabel remained in the wagon seat with her arms folded and her expression set to disapproving. "Clara," Gerald said. "Gerald," she said, "you look well." He said it with the slight surprise of someone who had not expected this. "I am well." He looked at the house behind her, the yard, the evidence of work done and order restored. She watched him take it in. "Appears you've settled in." "Yes. I came to see how you were getting on." He said it with a reasonableness that she did not trust. Gerald's reasonableness was always the surface of something else. I'm getting on fine. Good, good. He had his hat in his hands and was working the brim in a way that meant he was getting to something. The thing is, Clara, there's been some talk in Red Hollow. About what? About the situation here. People talking about a single woman living on a man's ranch without proper arrangement. He paused, chose his words, without it being formal. Clara looked at him. Formal? A proper contract, or another pause, some other arrangement. I have a job, Gerald. I have wages. Mr. Vance and I have a clear agreement. But that's not what people mean, and you know it. His voice dropped, became the voice of a man being frank because he cared, which she had never once believed. People are talking about your reputation, which, given what happened at the market, is what happened at the market was your doing, she said. He winced. I was trying to help. You were trying to get rid of me. Clara, what do you want, Gerald? She was done with the preamble. She had always been faster to the point than he was, which had always irritated him. He took a breath. I want to know what your intentions are, long term, because if this is just temporary work, you should think about coming back to Red Hollow. I've spoken to a woman there who runs a boarding house. No. Clara, listen. I'm not going back to Red Hollow. She kept her voice even. I'm not going back to your house. I'm not going to a boarding house. She looked at him steadily. I'm staying here. He had the grace to look slightly cornered, which was as close to shame as Gerald got. It's not proper. You stood me on a platform and sold me to the highest bidder, she said. Don't talk to me about proper. Mabel made a sound from the wagon. Clara did not look at her. Gerald put his hat back on with the air of a man who had not gotten what he came for and was recalibrating. Vance is a hard man, he said. It was the same thing he'd said the day she left, almost word for word. He's had trouble with people before. There's talk about him too. What kind of talk? Just talk. Vague enough to mean nothing specific, which meant it was meant to plant unease rather than convey information. Clara recognized the tactic. I just want you to be careful. She looked at him for a long moment. Her brother, who was 10 years older and had inherited everything and had stood in a market square and described her body like it was livestock. Thank you for coming out, she said. I'm fine. You can go. His jaw tightened. I'm still your family. Yes, she said. You are. She went back inside. She did not watch him leave, but she heard the wagon turn in the yard and the wheels on the road back toward Red Hollow, and she stood in the kitchen and breathed for a moment with her hands flat on the work table. She became aware that she was not alone. Ruth was in the doorway to the hall, clearly having heard some portion of the conversation. The girl had the careful stillness of someone deciding whether to acknowledge what she'd witnessed. Was that your brother? Ruth asked. Yes. What did he want? Clara moved to the stove. To make sure I knew I could leave. Ruth was quiet for a moment. Are you going to? No, Clara said. Ruth sat down at the kitchen table. My uncle came after Mama died, she said. Papa's brother. He wanted us to come live with him. In Wyoming. She said Wyoming the way you'd say a place that exists on a map but not in your life. Papa said no. Daniel said no really loud. You didn't want to go. I didn't want to leave the ranch, Ruth said. It's... Mama's here. Not in a... She fumbled for a moment. The garden is hers. The kitchen is hers. The way the house smells is hers. If we'd gone to Wyoming, all of that would just be gone. Clara nodded. She understood this completely. Your mother made a home, she said. That doesn't disappear. Some of it was disappearing, Ruth said quietly. Before you came. Things were going, not bad, just fading, like nobody had enough energy to keep them up. She looked at the shelf of preserves on the right wall. Martha's system, fully restored. It's better now. Clara said nothing, but she felt the words settle in her chest somewhere, and she kept them there. She told Elias about Gerald's visit that evening after the children had gone to bed. She told it plainly, without drama, the way she told him most things, as information he was entitled to. They were sitting at the table with the remains of the evening's coffee and the low fire doing most of the work of making the room livable. He listened without interrupting, which was one of the things she'd come to appreciate about him. He was not a man who talked over what he was hearing in order to prepare his response. When she finished, he said, "What was the other thing? The talk about me?" She looked at him. "He didn't specify. It was meant to unsettle me." "Did it?" "A little," she said honestly. "Not because I believed him, because I don't know what he's referring to, and I don't like not knowing." Elias was quiet for a moment. He turned his cup on the table. "There was a land dispute," he said, 2 years back. Man named Holt Deering. He claimed a portion of the east pasture was his by an arrangement he'd made with the previous owner before I bought the property." He paused. "He was wrong. I had the deed, but he's a man who makes friends in town, and I'm a man who doesn't, and the story that went around was not the accurate one." "What was the story that went around?" "That I'd run him off land that was partly his." His voice was flat. "Deering's a drinker and a talker. He's been telling that story for 2 years in every saloon between here and Red Hollow." "And the truth?" "The truth is in the county records. The east pasture is mine. Has been since I bought this property 11 years ago." He looked at the fire. "I didn't fight the story because I don't have the patience for fighting things with words. I figured the people who mattered would know." "The people who don't matter have loud voices," Clara said. "Yes," he said. "That's been my experience." She thought about what Ruth had said, that Daniel had said no really loud when the uncle came from Wyoming. She thought about what it meant to have a family that would do that would refuse to be moved. She thought about Gerald's wagon turning in the yard. "Deering," she said. "Is he still in the area?" "He's got a place about 6 miles south. He comes through Declan's Crossing regular." Elias looked at her. "Why?" "Just knowing the landscape," she said. He studied her for a moment with that considering look. "Clara, is there something you're not saying?" "I don't know yet," she said. "When I know, I'll say it." He accepted this. It was another thing she'd come to appreciate. He didn't push for more than she was ready to give, which was not a quality she'd encountered often. She went to her room and lay in the dark and thought about what Gerald had actually come to accomplish. He had come to check whether she was settled enough to resist being dislodged. He had come to plant doubt, and underneath both of those things, she suspected, was something else. The particular discomfort of a man who had made a public spectacle of his sister and was now becoming aware that the spectacle had not resolved the way he'd intended. She was not, as he'd perhaps expected, struggling. She was not grateful. She was not diminished by what had happened in the square. She was building something. The thought settled in her like a foundation stone. She was building something. She could feel it in the daily weight of the work, in the way the house had changed in 2 months, in the children who were different now than they'd been when she arrived. Not fixed, because they were not broken, but steadier, less alone in themselves. And there was the matter of Elias. She was honest with herself about the matter of Elias because dishonesty in that direction would have been dangerous. She was aware of him in ways that went beyond the practical, had been for a while now. The morning coffees, the evenings at the table, the way he listened, the way he'd looked at her the morning after Lily's fever, with something in his face that he'd chosen not to name and she'd chosen not to pursue. She was not naive about what it would mean to let that become something. She had not been in a situation that could become something since a long time before Red Hollow, and even then it had not ended well. She was 30. No, she was aware she was not young by the standards of the territory, that she had what her family called deficiencies and what she called circumstances, and that a man with 5 children and a ranch and a complicated grief was not an uncomplicated prospect. But she was also a woman lying awake in the dark thinking about the way a man had looked at her, and she was honest enough to name it. She put it away for now. There was too much else that needed tending. The trouble with Holt Deering arrived not as she'd expected, not as a confrontation, not as something loud, but sideways, the way real trouble usually came. It came through Thomas. Thomas was 11, and the quietest of the Vance children, the one Clara had taken longest to read. He processed things slowly and thoroughly, like a millstone. Whatever went in came out ground fine, but it took time. He had started talking to her more in the weeks since Lily's illness, the way children sometimes opened up after a shared crisis, and she had learned to listen to him the way you listen to someone who said important things infrequently and without announcement. He came to her on a Saturday in late November while she was mending in the kitchen. There were men looking at the east fence yesterday, he said. She kept her eyes on the mending. What men? I don't know them. One of them was older, red-faced, had a horse with a brand I didn't recognize. Where were you? Near the creek. I was checking the traps. He paused. They didn't see me. They were looking at the fence posts and talking, and one of them wrote something down. Clara set down the mending. Did they come onto the property? They were on the other side of the fence, but they were measuring, I think, with a rope. She looked at him. He was watching her with the careful attention of a child who has brought information to an adult and is waiting to see if the adult understands its significance. You did right to tell me, she said. Don't mention it to your brothers and sisters yet. Tell your father tonight, at supper, the same way you told me. Just the facts, what you saw. Is something wrong? Thomas asked. I don't know yet, she said. But your father should know. Thomas nodded. He was not a child who needed things softened. He received information the way he gave it, straight. She thought about it all afternoon. Deering, the east pasture, a man with a rope measuring along a fence line. Gerald's visit and his mention of talk in Red Hollow, talk about Elias, vague and planted. She did not know what was being arranged, but she knew the shape of the thing. She had grown up watching Gerald manage situations. The patient accumulation of small pressures, the stories told in the right ears, the preparation of ground before the real move. She recognized the approach even when she couldn't see the specific plan. At supper, Thomas told Elias what he'd seen, carefully and completely. And Elias's face went through several things quickly and then settled into a stillness that was not calm. After the children had gone up, Elias sat at the table for a long time. He's been quiet for a year, he said. Deering, I thought he'd let it go. Men like that don't let things go, Clara said. They wait. He looked at her. What are you thinking? I'm thinking someone should go to the county records office in Fallow Creek and get a copy of your deed. She said it as a statement of practical necessity, not a suggestion. Before anyone else has reason to look at those records. I know what my deed says. I know you do, but a copy in your hand is different from a document in an office. She folded her hands on the table. And I'm thinking you should talk to someone in Declan's Crossing, a lawyer, if there is one, or whoever handles legal disputes. There's a man named Albright, Elias said slowly. He handles land matters. Go see him. He was quiet for a moment. This is going to cost money. Yes, she said. Not going to see him might cost more. He looked at her across the table, the same direct look he'd given her various times across these 2 months, the look that was trying to figure her out and making incremental progress. Why are you doing this? Which part? Any of it. Gerald came here and tried to take you back to Red Hollow, which would have been easier. Gerald didn't try to take me anywhere, she said. Gerald tried to make me want to go. There's a difference. Why do you stay? He said it plainly, not manipulatively, not fishing for something, genuinely asking. She thought about how to answer that honestly. Because the work is real, she said. Because the children are real. Because, she paused, chose carefully. Because, for the first time in a very long time, I'm somewhere that needs what I actually have. Not what someone wishes I had instead. He was looking at her. She kept her eyes on the table. Red Hollow didn't need you, he said. Red Hollow needed me to be smaller and quieter and able to produce children, and they were not interested in substitutes. She said it without bitterness. It was simply true. This ranch needed someone who could hold things together. That's something I know how to do. You do, he said, simply, like a fact. She made herself look at him then. He was not looking away. In the low firelight, his face had the particular quality of a face that has stopped managing its expression for a moment, and what was underneath was something she had to make herself not respond to directly. Go see Albright, she said. A corner of his mouth moved. Yes, ma'am. He went to Declan's Crossing the following Monday. He came back in the late afternoon with a copy of the deed, which he laid on the kitchen table and which was exactly what he'd said it was. The east pasture, clearly within the boundaries of the Vance property, purchased 11 years prior with full documentation. He also came back with information. Deering had filed a preliminary claim with the county office in Fallow Creek 3 weeks ago. It was not a lawsuit, not yet. More of a formal expression of intent, the kind of thing that cost a small fee and established a paper trail. Albright had told Elias this was a tactic, that Deering was testing the water, seeing whether Elias would respond or whether he could be pressured into a settlement to make the nuisance stop. "He wants money," Elias said. He said it with the flat anger of a man who had worked for everything he had. "Or he wants people to think the claim has merit," Clara said, "which does the same work." "Albright says I have a strong position." "You have the right position," she said, "which isn't always the same thing as a strong one, depending on who's doing the judging." He looked at her. "You have a lot of experience with the wrong people judging." "Some," she said. Daniel was in the kitchen doorway. She hadn't heard him come in. He was looking at the deed on the table with an expression that had gone hard around the edges in a way that reminded her of Elias. "Deering," he said. Not a question. "Yes," Elias said. "I remember him." Daniel came into the kitchen and stood at the table looking at the deed. "He came here once. After Mama died, I answered the door. He said he'd come to offer his condolences, and he spent the whole time looking at the property." His jaw worked. "I didn't know what it meant then." "He was assessing," Clara said. "He thought we'd be weak," Daniel said. "He thought, after Mama—" He stopped. "He thought grief would make you easy to push," Clara said. "People like that watch for when a family is down." Daniel's eyes came to her. Not the resistant look, not the conflicted look, something clearer. "What do we do?" She noticed the we. She thought Elias noticed it too, from the slight change in his posture. "We respond formally," she said, "through Albright. We don't let the claim sit without answer, and we make sure people in Declan's Crossing know that the claim is being contested. Not loudly, not in a way that looks like worry, but clearly." "How?" Daniel said. "By being present," she said. "By going to town and not hiding. By being the kind of people others can see are not rattled." Daniel considered this. "You think he's been talking to people in town?" "I think men like Deering don't file claims in county offices without having prepared the ground," she said. "Your father has a reputation for keeping to himself. That's been used against him in the story Deering tells. The remedy is showing people a different story." Elias said, "You're talking about going to Red Hollow." She had not been talking about that, but she looked at him and understood why he'd said it. Red Hollow was not just the place Gerald lived. It was the county seat. It was where the largest number of people who had heard various versions of various stories would be found. It was, in other words, the place where being seen mattered most. "Yes," she said after a moment. "Eventually." The words sat between them. She had not been back to Red Hollow since September. She was aware of what going back would look like, to Gerald, to the town, to the people who had stood in the market square on a Saturday morning and watched her brother sell her worth by the pound. She was aware of what she would need to be when she went, which was not small, not apologetic, not diminished. She thought she could manage that. 2 months ago, she was not sure. Now she thought she could. "Not yet," she said. "First, Albright needs to respond to Deering's claim. First, we get through December, which is going to be hard enough without adding that particular trip." She looked at Elias. "But in the new year?" He nodded slowly. Daniel was still looking at the deed on the table. "He's not going to take this land," he said. Not to either of them in particular, just said, "the way you state something that is not negotiable." "No," Clara said. "He's not." She meant it the way he meant it. Not as reassurance, not as comfort, but as a simple fact about what was going to happen. She had not come this far, had not spent this particular fall being burned down and rebuilt in ways she hadn't expected, to watch someone else's patience and calculation dismantle what this family was in the process of becoming. The silver coin was still on the windowsill of her room. $1. Not buying anything. She thought sometimes about what Elias had said that day in the market square, in front of everyone, with the particular quietness that had made the crowd go still. He wasn't buying a servant. He was giving a forgotten woman a chance to prove her worth. She thought she had been proving it every day since, in the specific currency of this place and these people, a broth made right, a fever managed, a kitchen restored, a deed on a table, a 16-year-old boy saying we without noticing that he'd said it. She was not going to let Holt Deering, or Gerald, or Red Hollow, or any of the stories being told in saloons between here and the county seat, take that. She cleared the deed off the table and folded it and handed it to Elias. Put that somewhere safe, she said, and get some sleep. There's work tomorrow. He took the deed. He looked at her for one moment more, the look that said something he hadn't found words for yet. Then he went. December was the hardest month, and not because of Deering. December was hard because winter on the prairie did not negotiate. It arrived with the particular indifference of something that had been coming for a long time and had no interest in whether you were ready. The temperature dropped fast in the first week and kept dropping, and the wind off the northern mountains had a quality to it that was less weather and more argument, persistent, personal, as though it had specifically identified this ranch and these people and intended to test them. Clara had prepared as well as she could. The stores were solid, the firewood was stacked high on both sides of the house, the gaps in the walls she'd found in October had been addressed, and the kitchen roof extension held. But preparation and reality were two different conversations, and the reality of a frontier winter with 5 children, one recovering from a serious illness, and a land dispute sitting like an undetonated thing in the background. That reality had a weight to it that no amount of practical preparation fully addressed. Lily held up better than Clara had feared. She was careful with her, watchful for any return of the chest congestion, and Lily, for her part, seemed to understand at 5 years old that her body required more caution than other bodies, and she accepted this the way she accepted most things, with the quiet, gray-eyed practicality that still sometimes stopped Clara mid-task. The little girl had developed a habit of appearing in the kitchen in the early mornings and sitting at the table while Clara worked, not talking necessarily, just present, the way she was present with Sunday in the barn. Clara had come to count on it. Christmas came and went with the low-key determination of a family that was not going to be defeated by a difficult year, but was also not going to pretend the year had been easy. Clara made a proper meal, the best she could do with what they had, which turned out to be considerable. Ruth baked for the first time on her own initiative, a spiced cake from her mother's recipe that she produced from memory with a combination of pride and terror that resolved into relief when it came out of the oven right. Caleb carved something for Lily from a piece of scrap wood that was identifiably a horse, if you knew what you were looking at. Thomas gave May a length of ribbon he'd traded for at the Declan's Crossing General Store on the last supply run, which was so uncharacteristically thoughtful that May cried, which mortified him. Daniel gave Clara a pair of work gloves. Good ones, heavy leather, well-made, the kind that cost something. He handed them to her without ceremony, without preamble, while she was in the kitchen on Christmas morning, and said only, "Your hands were cracked last week. That's not good when you're working." She looked at the gloves. She looked at him. "Thank you, Daniel," she said. He shrugged one shoulder and left. But at dinner he sat beside her, which he had not done before, and when she asked him to pass the salt, he did it without the careful blankness that had characterized their early exchanges. Just pass the salt. Like a person passing salt to someone at the same table. She did not make a thing of it, but she felt it, the same way she'd felt Ruth's comment about the kitchen, the same way she felt Lily's early morning presence, as a kind of confirmation, quiet and specific, of something being built. Elias noticed the gloves. He didn't say anything about them, but he saw them on her hands the following morning when she came out to help bring water up from the well, which had developed a tendency to freeze at the handle in overnight temperatures, and something in his face settled in a way that told her the gift had not been a surprise to him. "Did you know he was going to do that?" she asked. "I knew he was thinking about it," Elias said. "He asked me what size your hands were. I told him I didn't know." "How did he figure it out?" "He asked Ruth." Clara smiled at the handle of the water bucket. Ruth had not said anything about being consulted. Of course she hadn't. The new year arrived, and with it the things she'd said would come in the new year. The trip to Red Hollow. She had been thinking about it since November, thinking about what it needed to be and what it could not be. It could not be a performance of triumph. That was not her nature, and it would not be believed. It could not be an apology or an explanation, because she had done nothing that required either. It needed to be simply her presence, her undiminished presence, in a place that had seen her at what the town believed was her lowest point, so that they could see that the point had not been the end of anything. She told Elias she wanted to go in the second week of January. He looked at her carefully and said, "Do you want me to come?" She had thought about this. "Yes," she said, "but not in a way that looks like protection. We'll go for the supply run we've been putting off. Business. And the children?" She had thought about this too. "Ruth and Daniel, the others are too young for what this might be, and I don't want them to see it if it goes badly." She paused. "I don't think it will go badly, but I don't know." He nodded. "When have you ever not known?" It was the closest thing to a compliment about her judgment that he'd offered directly, and it landed differently than the others. She let it. They went on a Wednesday. Clara, Elias, Ruth, and Daniel in the wagon with the supply list and the deed copy, which Elias had brought without her asking, folded in his inside coat pocket. The road to Red Hollow was 11 miles of winter prairie that looked exactly the same the whole way, flat and brown and cold under a sky the color of a pewter plate. Clara sat in the back with Ruth, and the two of them said little, which was comfortable now in a way it hadn't been in September. Ruth had her mother's system for the supply list and was going through it with a competence that was no longer effortful. It had become just the way she did things. Daniel was in the front beside Elias. He sat straight. He had his father's posture in the wagon, that easy, one-handed quality, and Clara wondered if he knew he'd inherited it. Red Hollow appeared over a low rise the same way it had disappeared behind them in September, without ceremony. It was bigger than the Vance Ranch and smaller than Fallow Creek, a proper frontier town with a main street of dirt and board and all the necessary establishments of a place that had decided to be permanent. The smithy was still clanging. The feed store was where it had been. The saloon looked unchanged. The market square was empty in January. Of course it was. But Clara looked at the wooden platform as they drove past and felt it the same way you feel a scar. Not pain exactly, more a specific awareness of a place on the body that had been through something. She did not look away from it. Their first stop was the general store, which was the practical anchor of the visit. Mrs. Hartley was behind the counter, the same woman who had been in the crowd in September with her expression of fascinated discomfort, and she looked up when they came in and went through a visible series of adjustments. Clara met her eyes and said, "Good morning, Mrs. Hartley. We have a supply list." Mrs. Hartley said, "Good morning, Miss Whitmore," and her voice had something in it that wasn't quite apology and wasn't quite acknowledgement and landed somewhere between both. She took the list. While Mrs. Hartley was assembling the order, two women came into the store who Clara recognized. She didn't know their names, but she knew their faces from the square. They stopped when they saw her. Clara nodded to them, pleasantly, with the specific pleasant neutrality of a woman who is aware of the social weight of a moment and has decided not to give it more than its due. One of them said, "Miss Whitmore, you're looking well." "I am well," Clara said. "Thank you." The second woman, the bolder one, Clara assessed, said, "You're still out at the Vance Ranch?" "Yes." "And how is that going?" The question had a texture to it, not quite hostile, more the kind of probing that passed for conversation in small towns, where information was currency and people collected it openly. "Well," Clara said, "Mr. Vance runs a good operation. The children are healthy. We heard the youngest was ill in the fall." "She was," Clara said. "She recovered." A pause. The two women exchanged a look of the type that carried entire conversations. "Well," the bolder one said, "it's good you were there." "It is," Clara said simply, and turned back to the counter. She heard them whispering behind her. She did not turn around. She felt Ruth beside her, very still, watching the whole exchange with the attention of a girl who was learning something. Gerald found her, as she'd known he would, in the street outside the feed store. He appeared with his coat and his prepared manner and his hat in his hands, and he looked at her and then past her at Elias, who was loading the wagon with Daniel, and something moved across Gerald's face that she took a moment to read. It was not what she expected. She'd expected the defensive reasonableness, the management of a situation. Instead, what she saw, very briefly before he covered it, was something more complicated. A man looking at his sister and having to acknowledge that the thing he'd been telling himself about her, the story in which she was a problem requiring management, had not survived contact with evidence. She was not struggling. She was standing on a main street in Red Hollow, in good winter clothes, with her chin level, and her hands in leather gloves that someone had given her because he'd noticed her hands were cracked. And beside her was a 13-year-old girl who looked at her with something adjacent to admiration. And behind her was a man who had chosen to come with her to this particular town on this particular errand with the specific knowledge of what it meant. Gerald cleared his throat. Clara. Gerald. Supply run? Yes. He looked at the wagon again, at Elias and Daniel working. How's the ranch? Good, she said. Strong winter. We're well prepared. The children. All healthy. Lily had a bad fever in October, but she came through it. He turned his hat in his hands. I heard about Deering, he said, filing that claim. She looked at him carefully. Where did you hear that? Deering drinks at the saloon here sometimes. He talks. Gerald's voice had an odd quality. Not quite shame, but its neighbor. He said Vance wouldn't be able to hold the property, said it was going to be a long legal fight. Albright has responded formally, Clara said. The deed is clear. Deering has no legal standing. He has friends, Gerald said. So do we, Clara said. This surprised him. She could see it. The we surprised him most. He was quiet for a moment. A wagon went past behind them, and the sound of it filled the space between them. And when it was gone, Gerald said, with a difficulty that was not entirely performance, I was wrong. What I did in September. I've known it for a while, but I wanted to say it. She looked at him. She had thought about this moment, what she would feel, what she would say. She had thought she would feel vindication, or anger finally released, or some version of satisfaction. What she actually felt was more tired than anything else. The tiredness of having carried something for a long time, and now being given permission to set it down. I know you know it, she said. That's not the same as saying it. No, she said. It's not. He looked at his hat. Mabel thinks you should come for dinner sometime. When you're able. She took that in. Mabel, who had stood in the kitchen doorway watching her pack with a thin satisfaction, was extending an invitation. The world was full of surprises. Maybe in the spring, she said, when the roads are better. It was not forgiveness exactly. She was not sure she was ready for that, and she was not going to perform it when she wasn't. But it was a door left open rather than shut, and that was what she could honestly offer. Gerald nodded. He put his hat back on. He looked at her one more time, really looked, the way he hadn't done in years, maybe longer. And he said, You look like yourself. She didn't know exactly what he meant by that, but she thought it might be the kindest thing he'd ever said to her. She went back to the wagon. Elias was watching her from beside the horse. Daniel was in the back of the wagon, and Ruth had appeared from somewhere and was already climbing up. Clara walked to the wagon, and Elias offered his hand, which she took, and he helped her up. All right? He said quietly. Yes, she said. He looked at her for a moment, checking, the way he'd learned to check, not intrusively, not with the implication that she couldn't manage, but the way you check on someone you've come to care about. Then he climbed up and got the horse moving, and Red Hollow fell away behind them for the second time. Daniel said from the back, Did you talk to your brother? Yes, Clara said. What did he say? He apologized. A pause. Did you believe him? She considered that honestly. I believe that he meant it today, she said. Whether he'll remember that he meant it tomorrow, I don't know. That's his work, not mine. Daniel was quiet for a moment. Then, my uncle from Wyoming, he wrote to Papa last month, said we should come stay with him for the winter, that the ranch was too much. His voice was controlled and flat. I wrote back. Clara looked at him. You wrote back. Papa doesn't like to write letters. He said it without apology. I told my uncle we were fine, that the ranch was in good shape and the family was together and we didn't need to go to Wyoming. She held his gaze for a moment. Did your father know you wrote that? He read it before I sent it. She looked at Elias. He was looking at the road. You didn't tell me, she said to him. No, he said. Why not? He took a moment. Because I wanted to see if you'd be glad or not. And now you know, she said. He kept his eyes on the road, but the corner of his mouth moved. The Deering matter resolved itself in February, and it resolved the way things resolve when one side has the documents and the other side has only the story they've been telling, slowly, with friction, and then all at once. Albright had filed the formal response to Deering's preliminary claim in December. In January, Deering had escalated to a full filing with the county office in Fallow Creek, which meant there was now an actual legal dispute on paper with the Vance property on one side and Holt Deering on the other. This was, Albright had explained, what Deering had wanted all along, not because he expected to win, but because the filing itself was the weapon. A property under legal dispute could not be easily sold or refinanced, and the stress of a legal fight had a way of making people more willing to settle than to continue. Clara understood this logic, and she did not accept it. She had spent 2 evenings in late January writing letters. She had told Elias she was writing letters, and he had looked at the paper and the pen and the careful way she was working and had not asked too many questions. She wrote to Albright, laying out in plain language everything she knew about the pattern of what Deering had done. The timing of his approach after Martha's death, Thomas's account of the men at the fence line, the stories being told in Red Hollow's saloon, Gerald's information about Deering's claims there. She wrote it as a coherent account, organized and specific, with dates where she had them. She also wrote to 3 other ranchers in the county whose names she had gathered in conversation since September, names mentioned by Elias, by Caleb in passing, by Mrs. Hartley in the general store. Men who had dealt with Deering before, or whose properties sat adjacent to disputed claims, or who simply had reason to care about how county land records were being used. She did not ask them for anything specific. She wrote simply to make them aware of what was happening with the Vance property, what Deering had filed, and what the documentation showed. She was not certain this would accomplish anything, but she was a woman who had learned that the people who talked loudest were often doing so because they were reasonably confident that no one was paying careful attention on the other side. She intended to be the careful attention. Albright wrote back in the second week of February with information he'd gathered from the county office. 2 of the 3 ranchers she'd contacted had also written to Albright independently. One of them, a man named Cord Hessler, whose South Pasture had been the subject of a similar Deering approach 4 years prior, had provided Albright with documentation from his own case that demonstrated a pattern. Deering had done this before. The county office in Fallow Creek, presented with this pattern documentation alongside the clear Vance deed, declined to proceed with Deering's claim. It was not dramatic. There was no courtroom scene, no public confrontation. Albright sent a letter, which arrived on a Thursday morning while Clara was in the kitchen, and which Elias read standing by the stove with his coat still on from the morning chores. He read it twice. Then he set it on the table. "It's done," he said. Clara dried her hands and came to read it herself. It said what he said it said. Deering's claim had been dismissed. The East Pasture was, unambiguously and on record, the property of Elias Vance. She set the letter down. The feeling she had was similar to the one she'd had the morning after Lily's fever broke. Not triumph, nothing loud, but the specific and grounded satisfaction of having done the right things in the right order and having them work. She had learned not to expect this feeling to arrive with fanfare. It usually didn't. It usually came quietly, like the temperature dropping in a sick child's forehead under your hand. "Your letters did this," Elias said. "Albright did this," she said, "and Hessler's documentation, and the county office seeing what the pattern was." The letters started the chain. She looked at him. "I wasn't going to let him take this land." Elias looked at her across the kitchen table, across the letter and the evidence of a February morning's work, and she saw in his face the particular thing she had been seeing more and more clearly since November, the thing she had been careful with because careful was how she survived. The look that meant she had become, somewhere in these 5 months, not just necessary, but something more particular than that, something he'd stopped pretending he didn't feel. She was not surprised when he came around the table. She was not surprised when he took her hand. She had been aware of it coming the way you are aware of a change in weather. Not the exact moment, but the direction. "Clara," he said. "Elias," she said. And because neither of them was young, and neither of them had arrived at this without history, and because the kitchen was warm and the land dispute was over, and somewhere in the barn, Sunday was standing patiently while Lily leaned against her flank, and because the practical facts of the situation were what they were, She said nothing else for a moment, and neither did he, and that was enough. He asked her to marry him in March. He did it badly. He had rehearsed something, she could tell, and then abandoned the rehearsal partway through and just said it plainly, standing in the kitchen doorway with mud on his boots and an expression of someone who had decided that preparation was not his particular skill and he was going to do it anyway. He said he knew she'd come here as a housekeeper, and that wasn't what he was asking her to be now. He said he knew he was not simple, that the ranch was not simple, that the children were not simple, and that he wasn't going to pretend any of it was otherwise. He said he had watched her for 5 months be more capable and more honest and more decent than anyone he'd known since Martha, and that he knew that was not a romantic thing to say, but it was the truest thing he had, and he was a man who preferred true. She listened to the whole thing. She did not help him with it. He needed to say it, and she was not going to make it easier in a way that later would mean he hadn't actually said it. When he finished, she said, "Yes, obviously." He blinked. "Obviously." "You've been working up to this since January," she said. "I was starting to wonder if you were going to make it to spring." He looked at her for a moment. "You could have said something. You needed to do it yourself." He exhaled. Then he laughed. Actually laughed. Not the near smile she'd come to know, but a real laugh, short and surprised and genuine, the kind you can't manage when you're performing anything. She had not heard him laugh before. She hadn't known it was there. The children's reactions were distributed across the full range of possible human responses, which was exactly what she would have expected. May cried immediately and then said she was happy and then cried more, which was May. Lily said, "Does that mean you're staying?" And when Clara said yes, Lily nodded once with the decisive satisfaction of a 5-year-old who had already figured this out and was glad the adults had caught up. Caleb said, "So you're going to be our mother," in a voice that was trying very hard to be neutral about this and was not succeeding in either direction. Clara said, "I'm going to be Clara. I've been Clara for 5 months, and I'll keep being Clara. You've got a mother. She built this kitchen and grew that garden and taught your brother how to harvest camphor plants, and she's in every part of this ranch. I'm not replacing anything." Caleb looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "All right," and went back to what he was doing, which was, for Caleb, an expression of significant acceptance. Thomas said nothing immediately. He came to her 2 days later while she was mending, and sat down and was quiet for a while and then said, "I'm glad you stayed. At Christmas, when I first thought about it, I'm glad you were here." "I'm glad too," she said. "I think Mama would have liked you," he said, with the careful thoughtfulness of a boy who had spent a long time considering this. She liked practical people. She didn't have patience for people who weren't straight. "That's a good description of your mother," Clara said. "Ruth told me you said that. About the kitchen." He looked at the shelf of preserves on the right wall. "That it made sense." "It does," Clara said. He nodded, satisfied, and left. Ruth came to her on a different evening, late, when the others were in bed. She sat at the kitchen table in a way that was reminiscent of their very first conversation weeks ago, and she said without preamble, "I need to tell you something." Clara set down her work. "I was angry at first," Ruth said, "when you came. I know you probably knew that. I suspected. Not angry at you exactly, just I'd been doing it, taking care of things, and then you came and you did it better and—" She stopped. "It felt like being told you hadn't been enough," Clara said. Ruth looked at her. "Yes." "You were enough," Clara said. "What you did for this family in the year before I came, that kept them together. I came into something that had already been held together. It was just fraying at the edges." Ruth was quiet. "I didn't know if you knew that." "I knew it from the first week," Clara said. "I knew it from the way the stores were organized. Someone had been careful. That was you." Ruth looked at her hands on the table. She was 13 years old and had spent a year holding the edges of something together and had not been thanked for it in the specific way that it needed to be named. Clara understood this. She had spent most of her own life being the person who kept the fire going, who hauled the water, and having it not be named. "Thank you, Ruth," she said, "for what you did." Ruth didn't say anything, but she lifted her chin in a way that said she had received it. "And Daniel." Daniel came to her on the morning before the wedding, which was a small thing in April. Just themselves and the minister from Declan's Crossing. No ceremony for the county to attend. Nothing Red Hollow needed to see. Clara had not wanted it large. She had had enough of being watched in public. He came into the kitchen early, before anyone else was up, and he stood in the same place he'd stood that first night when she was at the stove, and he was working up to asking what he could do. "I was wrong about you," he said. She looked at him. He was 16 and would be 17 in July, and had his father's jaw and his mother's dark eyes and neither parent's particular talent for saying what he meant, which he was doing now through sheer determination. "Not about wanting to protect the family," he said. "That wasn't wrong, but about you specifically. I decided before I knew." "You were trying to protect something real," she said. "I was a problem," he said bluntly. "You were a grieving boy," she said. "Who was trying to do a man's job? There's a difference." His jaw worked. "Lily asked for you before she asked for anyone now. In the mornings." "I know." "That used to be—" He stopped. "That used to be Mama." She held his gaze. "I know that too." I'm not saying it's wrong, that," he said. "I just wanted to say that I see it, and it's all right." He said the last part with the specific difficulty of someone saying something that cost them. "Thank you, Daniel," she said. She said it the same way she'd said it about the gloves. Straight, without softening it into something less than it was. He nodded once, and then, before he left, he said, "She would have liked you." It was the second time she'd heard that in 2 weeks. The second Vance child who had worked their way to the same conclusion. She didn't know if it was true. She would never know if it was true. But she understood what it was being offered as, the closest thing these children had to a benediction, the closest thing they could give from the place where Martha still lived in them. She was 40 miles from Red Hollow on the day she married Elias Vance, standing in the main room of a ranch house she had spent 7 months making livable, wearing her best dress with her hair done properly for the first time since September, and the minister from Declan's Crossing said words she barely heard because she was looking at the man in front of her and the children arranged behind him. Ruth trying to keep her expression composed and not quite managing, Caleb standing up straight with the deliberate posture of a boy who had decided this was an occasion, Thomas with his hand on Lily's shoulder because Lily was bouncing slightly and someone needed to anchor her, May already crying, Daniel at the back, arms at his sides, watching with his father's eyes and his mother's steadiness. She thought about September, the wooden platform, the pewter sky, Gerald's voice describing her deficiencies to an audience. She thought about the feeling of standing very straight and looking at the far end of the square and counting the things she knew how to do. She had not known then how long the list was. The years that followed were not simple. She had never expected simple, and simple was not what she received. The ranch had good years and bad years, a drought the summer after the wedding that hit the cattle hard, a winter 2 years later that was worse than the one she'd arrived in, a grass fire in the east pasture that took a week and every available hand to contain. She and Elias did not agree on everything. There were arguments, real ones, not the managed kind, arguments where both of them said things that were too sharp and had to come back to later and work through. He was a man who went silent when he was hurt, which drove her to distraction. She was a woman who sometimes made decisions without telling him first, which drove him to the same. They got through it. Not because it was easy, but because they were both people who did the work in front of them and didn't stop when it got hard, and it turned out that was the most important compatibility. Lily grew. She stayed small and delicate in frame, but turned out to have her mother's stubbornness and her father's quiet. And she never entirely lost the too-old quality in her gray eyes, which Clara thought she would carry her whole life, the mark of a child who had understood loss early. She and Sunday remained a fixture of the barn until Sunday went old and slow, and when the mare died, Lily was 11 years old and sat with her at the end and did not ask Clara to make it not hurt, only asked her to sit there too, and Clara did. Thomas became a man who fixed things. It was his particular gift, not just physical things, though he could fix those too, but situations, misunderstandings, the places where people had gotten sideways with each other. He did it the same way he'd always processed things, slowly and thoroughly, and he became the Vance that neighbors came to when something needed to be worked out. May grew up with the button-missing dress and the frank assessment and never entirely lost either quality. She talked too much, laughed too loud, and knew what everyone around her was feeling with an accuracy that was occasionally inconvenient. She married a man from Declan's Crossing when she was 19 and moved 6 miles away and came back to the ranch for dinner every Sunday for the rest of Clara's life. Caleb stayed on the ranch. He was the one who wanted it, who had always wanted it, Clara thought, from the first day when he'd shown her how to lay the fire. He took to cattle the way his father had, with the same practical, unromantic love of the work itself. And when Elias got older and slower, it was Caleb who carried the operation forward. Ruth became, against her own expectations, a teacher. She went to Fallow Creek at 17 and then further east to a proper school and came back with a certificate and a calm authority that her students found slightly frightening and entirely effective. She ran the school at Declan's Crossing for 20 years. She was by every measure exceptional at it. And Daniel stayed the longest and left the most thoroughly, which was not a contradiction. He was there for every year of his siblings' childhoods, present and reliable in the way that the ranch required. And then when Caleb was settled enough to run things, and Thomas was there to help, he went west. He wrote letters, regular ones, which surprised Clara and shouldn't have, because Daniel had always done the things he decided to do with commitment. The letters came from California, from Oregon, from eventually a piece of land he bought in Nevada where he ran horses. He wrote well. He was direct on paper the way he'd learned to be direct in person, and Clara kept every letter in a box in the bedroom. He came back to the ranch the year Clara turned 50. He was 36 and broader than he'd been, with lines around his eyes from the Nevada sun, and he came in the spring when the kitchen garden was up and sat at the same kitchen table and drank coffee with her and said, "You never left." "No," she said, "even when Gerald came, even when Deering filed, even when it would have been easier." "Easier isn't a reason," she said. He turned his cup on the table. "I've thought about that a lot, over the years." He looked at the shelf of preserves on the right wall, Martha's system, still intact. "Why people stay and why they go." "And?" "I think some people are built for staying," he said. "I'm not. You are." He looked at her. "Not because you had nowhere else to go. You could have gone. You chose not to." "Yes," she said. "I used to think that was, I don't know, settling, like you were making the best of something you couldn't change." He shook his head. "It wasn't that." "No," she said. "It wasn't." "What was it then?" She thought about that. She had thought about it at various times in the way you think about things that have defined your life, not to analyze them apart, but to understand what they meant. "I think some people spend their lives looking for a place where what they are is the right thing," she said, "and most of them never find it. And I did. The first week I was here, I could see what this place needed, and I had it. That's not settling. That's the best luck there is." Daniel was quiet for a long time. Outside, the spring prairie was brown going green, the same view it always was, endlessly patient. "She would have liked you," he said, for the second time in his life. "You said that before," Clara said, "before the wedding." "I know." He looked at her. "I meant it more now." The silver coin sat on the windowsill of their bedroom for 22 years. Elias had noticed it there from the beginning and never moved it, and Clara had never explained it, and he had never asked, and that was one of the best things about him, his understanding of when something was a person's own. One evening in their 10th year together, she told him the whole of it, the tin with $12.40, the coin in her palm on the wagon, the way she'd held it closed in her fist on the road out of town. He listened the way he always listened. Then he said, $1. $1, she said. He picked up the coin from the windowsill and turned it in his fingers. "I put it down because I was angry," he said. "Not at you, at your brother, at the whole situation. I put down the least amount I could and said the thing I needed to say, and then I didn't think about it again." "I know," she said. "It became something else," he said. "It was already something else," she said. "From the moment you put it down." He set it back on the windowsill. She had come to Red Hollow with $12.40 and no good prospects, and a brother who had described her worth in public with the confidence of a man who knew his audience. She had been told, in various ways and by various people across her life, that she was too much and not enough simultaneously, too large, too stubborn, not fertile, not small, not the right kind of woman for the world as it was organized. The world as it was organized had turned out to be negotiable, not easily, not without cost. She had paid in specific ways: the platform, the coin, the November nights in a cold, narrow room with a bad mattress, the mornings when she had made herself get up and do the work without knowing whether the work was building toward anything. She had paid in all of it, but she had gotten something real in return. Not the life she'd been told she couldn't have. She had never particularly wanted that life, the one Red Hollow had in mind for women of her description. She had gotten something different. 5 children who had grown into people she would have chosen, a man who had chosen her back, a ranch that ran because of things she had done and continued to do, the 10,000 small, consistent things that nobody was going to put up a monument to, but that held the whole structure together. The woman who had stood on a wooden platform in September had been counting the things she knew how to do. She had not known how long the list was. She knew now. Belonging, she had learned, was not given. It was not granted by the right circumstances or the right body or the right history. It was built the way you built anything that lasted, slowly, with the materials available, in all kinds of weather, without the guarantee that it would hold. It held.